thing about naked mole rats is that they already live far, far longer than a similar rodents of their size. A rat of that size might live 6 years. The oldest naked mole rat in captivity is 35 years old. So that's very curious, and so that got scientists interested in looking at how naked mole rats age. And what they discovered is that really they don't age, or at least they don't age the way that we do, like we grow old and eventually we die. A naked mole rat doesn't grow old and die. They do die, of course, but they die because they get eaten by a snake, or they, cut themselves and get an infection, or they get some sort of disease. But they don't die of just old age, of just wearing themselves out. If something like that doesn't happen, eaten by a snake or whatever, in theory, they just might keep going. A 35-year-old naked mole rat, a wizened old naked mole rat, is no more likely to die on any given day than a young and spry 3-year-old naked mole rat. And so theoretically, if you could avoid accidents and disease and snakes, you might just live forever as a naked mole rat. There's one other animal that I know like that, the aptly named immortal jellyfish. These jellyfish have the property that when they've gotten to a ripe old age and they've accumulated the wear and tear of aging, they have this trick where their cells all revert to a fetal state and they essentially spontaneously regenerate themselves. It's like they do a reboot and start over. So in theory, if they don't get eaten, they too could live forever. Now here's why this annoys me. I took Latin in high school, and I was really good at it. Or at least I thought that I was, but it turns out what I was really good at was fake Latin. Fake Latin is the sentences they give you to translate so that you can learn the grammar. And they're all sentences like, the farmers rejoice, the horses haven't been withdrawn from the field. And they never made a lot of sense, but I could translate those like nobody's business. But then you get to real Latin, written by actual Romans, and the sentences are like 9 miles long. And they're clauses inside of clauses inside of clauses like those Russian nesting dolls. And they're just impossible. And I discovered that I could not read actual Latin at all. And that actually annoyed me, but it turns out it takes a great investment of time to be able to read actual Latin. And there were only so many hours of the day, and when I left high school, other priorities took over. And I've always had this longing that one day I could sit down and read actual Latin, and this longing is increasingly tempered by the suspicion that that is not probably ever going to happen because of time. In our reading, the poet Adrian Rich laments, "I've sat on a stone fence above a green so dense with life, minute, momentary life, slugs, moles, pheasants, gnats, spiders, moths, hummingbirds, groundhogs, butterflies. A lifetime is too narrow to understand it all." And it is to me one of the most aching tensions of the human condition that we are gifted with this beautiful, miraculous, magical earth, this teeming green ocean of existence and possibility. And a lifetime is too narrow to understand it all. Too narrow really even to scratch the surface of understanding, to follow the thinnest thread of inquiry, unless apparently one is a naked mole rat or a jellyfish, and then you are given all the time in the world, hence my annoyance. Now, embedded within the larger miracle of the world is another miracle, a smaller miracle unto itself, before which I am just as awestruck and just as humbled, and that is the miracle of the human mind and the human person. Just on a physical level, just looking at the brain, we're talking about an organ of staggering complexity. There are at least 100 trillion neural connections in your brain. 100 trillion. That is 1,000 times the number of stars in the galaxy. That is unbelievable power and complexity. And out of that power and complexity, in a way that we honestly don't really understand, we don't have a good scientific explanation for it, we get consciousness. We get self-awareness and language. We get art. We get self-determination. We get the ability to sense and think and feel in response to the world around us, but also to form complex ideas. And most crucially, we are given the human capacity to wonder, to imagine alternate possibilities, and to dream up new worlds to explore. And then out of this realm of imagined possibility, we are given the freedom to make choices, to be the captain of our own fate. And so every human being born, I don't care what your station in life, I don't care what your occupation, you are, by virtue of being human, a creator, an explorer, a scientist, an artist, and a visionary. That is what it is to be human. And the tragedy of it is, as resident miracles within the greater miracle, we are still given just that small window of time to make sense of it all, to explore not just the world, but our own place in it. Not just the vastness of creation, but the vastness of our own potential. And we will not in our lifetime scratch the surface of all that we could be. And the challenge of it is, we inherit at birth this overpowered piece of machinery that is us, this staggering engine of complexity and creativity. And we're not given any kind of owner's manual at all. We're just thrown right into the mix of life, and it is up to us to figure it out as we go along. When I was a young teenager, I spent a summer helping my high school Latin teacher, the same one who failed to teach me Latin, helping him paint the outside of his house, which was pretty hard work, I quickly discovered. And one day I was sort of scraping away at the old paint, and one of his neighbors wandered over and struck up a conversation with me. And I cannot for the life of me remember how this conversation started, but he ended up drawing out of me this whole host of philosophical and religious ideas. It turned into like a religious conversation. And at the time, I was exploring a lot of different aspects of Eastern religion, like that Sufi wisdom tale. And so I must have talked about probably reincarnation, why I no longer identified as a Christian or a Catholic, doubts that I had about heaven and hell, and sort of my rejection of sort of traditional Western categories of religion. And we talked for a long time, and I thought it was a pretty good conversation. And when he left, his parting words to me were, "You're a thinker, and that's good, but that's also dangerous. It can lead you away from God." And he left. Now, if it had been his intention to further sour me on traditional religious thinking, he could not possibly have done any better. My whole being rebelled against the idea that thinking, questioning, exploring, challenging was a dangerous act. But from his perspective, there was a certain sense to what he was saying. Now, it's not my intention to draw Christianity with a broad brush. There are many traditions within Christianity that venerate knowledge and learning and encourage questioning and the sort of deep, honest grappling with faith and religious questions. So I'm not in any way knocking Christianity. But there is also within the Christian tradition this sort of spiritual binary system where one exists in a state of either being saved or unsaved. And from the perspective of that spiritual binary system, you can see why this person was sensing danger, because my spiritual exploration took the risk of knocking me off the path and moving me away from that state of being saved further and further into the state of being unsaved. And many children raised in such a binary system, and I can speak from personal experience, have the experience of being afraid that their doubts and that their questions might be bad or dangerous, that they might fall irreparably into the category of unsaved. Now, regardless of whether you're Christian, our larger culture also contains the deep imprint of this binary spiritual thinking. It is embedded in our Western way of thinking, this idea that good and bad are things that we are, that these are states of our being. These are existential. We are a good person or a bad person. We are saved or unsaved. We are upright or we are shameful. We are law-abiding or criminal, chaste or promiscuous, honest or dishonest, educated or uneducated, and especially successful or unsuccessful. These are the lenses through which our culture encourages us to see ourselves and see other people. And these categories then become judgments that we pass down on ourselves and others as we are each honestly going about the business of trying to figure out this life thing, right? That we have been tossed so rudely right into the middle of. And then these judgments become stories about who we are. Stories that we tell about ourselves. Stories that we allow other people to tell about us. Sometimes stories that we inherit from our family or from other people. And stories that we come to internalize and believe. And we forget, when we believe those stories, we forget the vastness of our own potential. That at any moment we have only barely scratched the surface of who we are and what we can be. Now, Unitarian Universalism, as a religious tradition, rejects the categorization of people into these binaries of saved and unsaved. In its place, we encourage what I will call an ethic of evolution. We assume that the spiritual journey, the religious journey, is one of continual growth and change. The great Reverend William Ellery Channing, who laid the foundation for Unitarianism back when it was a form of Christianity, he understood salvation not as this binary state that you either did or didn't have, but as a process through which you became kinder, more charitable, more loving, more forgiving over time. It was a process of moral and spiritual ascension. And Channing thought that this ascension was open to everyone all the time. And the means by which we achieve it is essentially practice. He wrote, whenever we invigorate the understanding by honestly and resolutely seeking truth, whenever we invigorate the conscience by following it in opposition to the passions, whenever we receive a blessing gratefully, bear a trial patiently, or encounter peril or scorn with moral courage, whenever we think, speak, or act with moral energy, then divinity is growing within us, and true religion thus blends itself with common life. And for Channing, this idea was so important that as we explore life and unfold our possibilities, divinity is growing in us. He called the sermon likeness to God because he thought ultimately through this ascension we could become very like the ultimate spiritual principle, which he called God. So this idea of Channing's is known as salvation by character. It has greatly influenced the Unitarian Universalist way of being religious because we view the goal of religious life not as achieving some final end state where we hope to remain, however precariously perched for the rest of our life, but rather to continuously evolve in understanding, to continuously unfold our potential throughout our life. We conceive of religious life not as a destination, but as a journey. And so our tradition encourages us to be lifelong learners. The school of life is in session at all times, and we are its students. As students of life, then, who have been thrown so rudely into the mix, we will want to be patient with ourselves and with others, because we are all relative novices at this life thing. We're all still learning and growing. We are in a state of constant improvisation. No one ever told us we should make of our lives study, like learning music, laments the poet Adrian Rich in a reading. We should begin with the simple exercises first and slowly go on trying the hard ones, but in fact we can't live like that. We take on everything at once before we've even begun to read or mark time. As students of life, we will want to be humble. There's a Zen story of a learned professor who goes to visit a Zen master ostensibly to learn, but really he is eager to demonstrate all that he already knows. And the Zen master sits with him and listens to him pontificate on everything that he understands about Zen. And finally he says, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And he sets out a cup of tea for the professor and he begins to pour. And he pours and he pours and he pours until the cup overflows and starts spilling onto the table, and the Zen master just keeps pouring, and the water, the tea, is spreading out all over the table. Finally, the professor can't take it, and he says, "Can't you see the cup is full? No more will go in." And the Zen master says, exactly. If you wish to learn about Zen, first empty your cup. As students of life, we must first empty our cup. As students of life, I urge us to resist these binary categories, the way of thinking that freezes people in one state of being and says, this is what you are, this is all that you are. We are, all of us, a vast unfolding potential. What we can be is greater than we know. What you can be is greater than you know. So let us not deny any of us, including ourselves, the potential to move and grow. If there is a category that you have put yourself in that has been holding you back, consider releasing yourself from that judgment and emptying your cup. I'm just not creative. I'm just not a people person. I'm just not a go-getter. I'm just not any good with money. I'm just bad. Whatever it is, release yourself from that judgment, because these are not states of being. They're just stories that we tell ourselves, or stories that we have heard, and stories that we've come to believe. But as students of life, we are never trapped in one story. We learn and grow, we evolve, we unfold new potential, perhaps undreamt of potential. We see this in our own children, we see this in the children around us at UUI all the time, and just like them, we are more than we know. So if you think you know all that you are, I invite you to empty your cup. If you think you know all that your neighbor is, I invite you to empty your cup. As the Sufi poet Rumi said, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. May we embrace the world in all its fullness with delight, with curiosity, with kindness, and with boundless compassion for all of us as lifelong learners. We are wandering and skipping and stumbling and running through that field together. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, let us create something holy and beautiful together. May it be so. Our